shout out and thanks to everyone behind the scenes that's making this go so smoothly. Thank you so much. We are so happy to be here. I'm coming to you from the Learning Games Lab here at New Mexico State University. I'm in a big room all by myself, so I took my mask off, but I had to come to the university because 1, high-speed internet, and 2, really powerful air conditioning. And it's, you know, it's getting hot in New Mexico, so hierarchy of needs. So our panel today wants to talk about accessibility for games, and we represent 4 different studios, 4 different businesses, 4 different groups that are working on improving accessibility, and we each have sort of different approaches to that. So I think one of the best ways to kind of understand where we're coming from on this is just to hear our stories. So with that, why don't we go ahead and I'm wondering if you all are seeing the screen. I'm hoping you're seeing the screen. I'm seeing a green screen. But if you all are seeing the screen, why don't I start by introducing our panel? So first, I'll introduce Allisyn Levy with BrainPOP.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here.
And Peter Stidwill with Fablevision.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here. Thank you.
And Matt Kaplowitz with Bridge Multimedia. So Matt, I'm not hearing you. I'm going to let you adjust your audio, but why don't we go ahead and start with our stories? And Allisyn, why don't you start by telling us kind of what a recent story that's shaped some of your thinking about accessibility?
Sure. So we had a dream scenario where a user wrote to us, and we could go to the next slide. And a mom wrote us this email. You have a little snippet of it in the next slide. And we learned about her son, Matthew, who has cerebral palsy. And we learned that he was a frustrated fan of BrainPOP. And his physical disabilities included low vision, minimal oral communication. He mainly used vision. He was in a wheelchair, and he had the use of 1 finger. And so we invited him into our office and asked him if he would be willing to show us what his experience of using BrainPOP was like. And we made it open to all of the departments. Everybody on our end was invited. It was a really rare opportunity to see our product in use, which we always jump on. So he and his mom agreed, and they came into our office. And watching Matthew was both inspiring and painful. And I don't know if you've ever tried navigating through your website with a screen reader, but that was a real eye-opener for a lot of us. Just the pace that Matthew is used to going as a low vision user, where he likes to get to where he's going. And it was very painful to see how long it took to do something very basic, or even navigate to the most basic button to trigger the main action on the page. That was like a real, like, okay, ouch. Matthew pointed out that even though he selected the option to save his password, his login credentials, our system has it so that it auto logs him out due to privacy reasons after a certain amount of time. So again, it gave us a real opportunity to think about having to log in every time using 1 finger, typing in your username and password. Another thing that we observed was issues with the font sizes. He needed the font sizes to be larger to be able to read them. But when you just zoomed in on our page, the page got very wonky. This one almost killed me, seeing that there was no undo button, realizing like, why did we not think of that? So a lot of really helpful lessons learned. Those are a couple highlights. We were so grateful to have this opportunity for our team. It really sticks to have these personal connections to our users. And around that same time, our insights team was inspired to create user personas. Has anyone created these? I can't see if you're agreeing or writing into the chat. So I'm going to assume that some of you have and some of you haven't. So we'll go to the next slide. The great thing for us was that creating user personas allowed us to turn what we were learning about our users into a tool for user-centered design. And fortunately, those who went before us and created user personas documented really well. And I'll include links to the ones that I mentioned, but Spotify documented their process of creating user personas. Those were a big source of inspiration. We relied on resources from Nielsen Norman to help frame our thinking and shifting to user-centered design. And we also just relied on a lot of our own research that we had been doing for many years, research on our users. And so putting together these user personas gave us a real tangible tool and helped us internally get on the same page in terms of getting to know our users and designing for the widest audience possible. And so now I like to encourage others to find their mantra. So thinking for us, could a user with the use of only one finger be successful using our website? And so now we like to think, if Matthew can use this, imagine how many others with unique needs can benefit and be successful interacting with our website. I'm going to turn it over to Peter to share his story.
Thank you very much, Allisyn. Super impactful story there. At Fablevision, we've been creating games and animation and interactives for almost 25 years. And we've recently formalized a set of core design principles, two of which are education for everyone and design for one, beneficial for all. So I'm going to share a story that embodies both of these design principles. We set out to create a prototype literacy game, which we call Mixed Libris, that was aimed at struggling readers and leveraged augmented reality. And the goal was to engage kids with the process of reading, and in particular to combat the summer slide. And we designed and laid out plans for a kind of immersive world, an overarching narrative that would link into various books, and a set of characters called the splots. You can see them on the left-hand side there. And these splots magically appear over the book pages at various points using the augmented reality. And the splots grow and evolve by listening to players read and completing, as well as the players completing comprehension activities and games. So it's super exciting, super fun. We playtest, we kind of focus grouped our characters and some of the stories early on. And then we developed a digital prototype pretty early, and we playtested our idea. And unfortunately, it failed. As we tested, we realized that there was too much going on. We had designed something that was causing cognitive overload for many of the kids who were playing it. We were asking players to hold up the device and point it at the book and read the book through the device. Plus, we also had a game-like interface and an augmented reality character. So the kids were struggling with the multiple planes of reality, and we needed to have them focus on just one thing. We hadn't fully thought through all the cognitive issues, but that's okay. We were trying to do something new, and that's why we were playtesting pretty early on.
So we look at kind of three crucial points that happen in gameplay. One is the game is providing information to the player visually, audibly. The game is somehow communicating to the player. The next step is the player has to determine what their action will be. What is it they are being asked to do, and what step are they going to take? And then the third is the player takes that action. So the player has to communicate that to the computer. So that brings us to the potential barriers. Barriers. Think if whoever has their finger on the slide advancer, we'll see maybe they are frozen as well. Okay, thank you. So the barriers are then, can the player receive the information that they need from the computer? Can they see it? Can they hear it? Can they get all of the cues they need? The next barrier is, can the player understand what it is they're supposed to do? What action is being requested from them? And do they know how to put that in? And then the third is, can the player use the interface? Can the player successfully communicate what it is they want to do, what button they want pushed, what car they want driven, what path they want to follow? Can the player use the interface to do that? All of these are wrapped up with the different types of accessibility. So these are often co-occurring, but we like to think of it in these terms. Cognitive, which can also impact behavioral issues as well. Cognitive issues, visual, which is low vision, no vision, contrast, color blindness, many different types of visual. Hearing, which again can be everything from no hearing, partial hearing, auditory overload, all of the issues related to hearing. And then motor, which is the ability to, the physiological ability to interact with the interface. So what we've done today is we have started with our kind of base list of it. We feel every studio, here's the starting point for what you can do. And we're going to talk through the main points for each of those areas, kind of just a checklist, things any studio can implement now. And we're going to start with cognitive. Matt, you want to take us through those?
I do. We're going to start by thinking about, just for a minute, when you have individuals with special needs, generally the amount of information they can process at one time is not going to be what our typically developing gamer is going to do. So the first thing to think about are ways that we can keep the excitement, keep the drama, keep the engagement, but without quite so much input that it can go to sensory overload. So what are some of those things we can do to reduce sensory overload and keep engagement? Well, the first one is to reduce or eliminate time pressure. You can still play the game, but there's more flexibility about time pressure. The next one related to it is pacing. How much does the game have to continue? When can the player have more time to breathe? The third item is to provide literal visual paths. That is, how much do they have to really figure out as far as what the challenge is? The next one is something as basic as the fonts. It's great to have fonts that are very stylized, but when it reaches the point that some of your players are struggling to understand the words or the numbers, that's not going to build your audience for the game. And finally, in the same way, for avoiding sensory overload, which is the direct relation to the cognitive thing, is a visually clean space. What Peter showed you in his game was beautiful. All the items in the second iteration, all the items were there, but it was clean. There was space. It was easy to find your way around. So avoiding that cognitive overload that Peter mentioned, that's one of the things. And speaking of Peter, why don't you pick it up on visual?
All righty, thank you. So the next section here is visual. And first up, there's a variety of cases that we need to recognize, including no vision, low vision, color blindness, and contrast as well. And for example, for the latter, we want to be ensuring that there's sufficient contrast between the text and the background that the text is placed on. So that's just an obvious one. Second up, we want to support text resizing. So this allows users to increase and change the font size without significantly affecting the layout of the game. So it definitely needs some additional thought on how to accommodate that increase in font size. And a kind of plus up on that as well, that you might even want to allow players to choose the font itself or the background and color of the font to create their own contrast levels. Third, we want to reinforce all the visual messages of the game. So for instance, we don't want to just use color alone to make critical information understandable. An example of that would be using red to show an error or a wrong response in a game. That also needs a visual, such as an X mark, and you could also add in an audio cue as well as an additional capability. Fourth, we want to optimize for the ability to allow for text to speech. So there are already a lot of options that exist that you can leverage in terms of text to speech, but there's some additional things that you need to think about. For instance, avoid putting text inside images. That way, it can't be read by screen readers, so you always want to separate those things out. And you also want to be mindful about the alt text for images or animation. Bad alt text can be as bad as having no alt text at all. And you want to make sure that the alt text for links and buttons are descriptive. So that means that that hidden piece of text, which is read out by a screen reader, describes what will happen when you click on that link or button. And if it's the case of a link, they know where they're going to go within the game. And then finally, you want to avoid flashing and strobe effects. That's bad for folks with ADHD. It can cause problems, and also can trigger epileptic seizures as well. Let's move on to hearing. So first, we want to give visual cues to match all of the audio. So for example, audio alerts should be accompanied by a visual indicator, and vice versa as well. For users with low or no vision, we want to provide auditory confirmation to reinforce an achievement in the game, for example. Second, we want to consider reading levels. And it's interesting to note that many students who are deaf from birth also have lower literacy levels. So that's something that we need to take account when we have text on the screen. And third, we want to give users control over audio outputs. And it's good practice to have at least 2, and where possible 3 options in your settings menu for music, sound effects, and voiceover, so folks can independently control those. And that's, it's obvious that those settings as well are useful for a more general game population. As with many of these recommendations, it's kind of running theme that a lot of these changes are also great for a more general audience too. Fourth, captions for audio. So whether it's voiceover during a cutscene or in-game, we want to have the option for captions, and ideally ones that the user has control over, so they can switch them on or off as required. And then finally, we want to consider audio descriptions as well. So the audio descriptions is where there is spoken narrative of key visual elements, such as action that happens, during a cutscene, or settings, or even like facial expressions of characters. So something that is important to the game and the narrative and the gameplay. So I'm going to pass it over to Allisyn to talk about motor.
Sure. So the first consideration is thinking about all of the keyboard input, making sure that's remappable to different devices, and vice versa. Anything that requires gameplay controls should also be keyboard accessible. Be mindful of swipe and drag interactions. Sometimes those can be problematic, so use your best judgment. I mentioned earlier, considering the hierarchy of navigation, all of the things that Peter just mentioned to do with alt text and audio descriptions, test it out for yourself, see what it is like to navigate, to do a simple task on your website using a screen reader, and see, are you having a clear menu and hierarchy for how to get to the most basic interactions. You don't want it to take 20 steps to have to get to a very simple task. And lastly, another repeat, but just considering the option to save usernames and passwords for one-finger users or other physical impairments that might make that excruciatingly painful to do, even though we think of it as simple, possibly. I am passing it back to you, Barb.
All right. So let's talk about, those are just some to-do items on our checklist, but let's talk about kind of action steps for our studios. I think our takeaways, as we have discussed them, is first, we want to engage with all communities to reach out. We have the New Mexico School for the Blind is right up the street from us here in Las Cruces. We're not in New York City where we have access to quite a wide range of people, but we do have communities here locally. So that's one of our big takeaways, is try to engage with communities, reach out to local camps or day camps or experts in your school and invite them into your studio, as Allisyn did, to give you feedback into the products that you're doing. Second is to create user personas. Allisyn spoke so beautifully about that, and on our resources page, and we'll find a way to share the PDF with you. We have a great link to Spotify and how Spotify created their user personas. That's something I know our studio is going to work on next. The big thing for me was that commit to continued learning. Unfortunately, this is not a one and done. In fact, wonderfully, it's not a one and done. It's something we can do. Find ways that encourages your studio to keep bringing this up. Do an accessibility club within your studio, or put it on your agenda to talk about it at developer meetings every couple of months, or find a doc or another kind of repository where your team can continually share the materials that they're getting and learning and growing, because this is going to continue. Our capabilities are going to improve as we keep learning about it. Of course, start with accessibility design. It is painful to go back and redo our work, but what's nice about that for us is then we're learning things that we can do when we're designing our new products right from the start. So from the start, accessible to everybody. And finally, as you've heard several times from us, to put yourself in other shoes. Set up an area where you can start user testing, or where you can follow those mantras, or you can go out into your community and test with others, so that we're really better able to put ourselves into each other's shoes. We're going to have a question and answer session after this, and I'm hoping that will be a great way for us to get some information from you all, and you can share resources that you have found or things that are really great for you. I wanted to mention some of our resources, and then I'm going to hit our panel with some other questions today. The Spotify personas is one that we already mentioned. The Nielsen-Norman accessibility design, the color contrast tool, that's a great place you can just start right now and send your materials to see how they look. So let me ask our panel. I know that we might have in our audience people who are starting their accessibility journey and people who have been doing it for a while. So let's hit those two extremes. There's one thing you would suggest someone starting out, one thing they could do to jump into accessibility. What would it be? Allisyn, what would you say?
I'm sticking with getting to know your users. Be resourceful, invite whoever you can, the widest range of audience, not just one person here or there who might have specific unique needs, but a whole range, as many as you can. And right now, that's probably even harder. Virtual makes it more possible. And this is certainly the right community to be connecting about that. I thought there were great suggestions from Mark's talk on able gamers earlier, and I'm so happy to see that there's a lot of sessions around accessibility. So getting to know your users is my number one.
Yeah, I echo that. Games for Change, you guys have just been boss about bringing accessibility to the forefront, so thank you. Matt, what's your recommendation? One thing. Oh, Matt, we've lost your audio again. Okay, you work on your audio. Peter, do you tell us your one thing?
I think it's that this is a kind of journey that you go on with accessibility, and that you need to be, as you said earlier, about continuously open and continuously learning about the different facets. And there are lots of resources that we've mentioned, and we can point you to, and others can point folks to as well. And it does seem sometimes it's a little overwhelming, because there's a lot of you have to consider more than what you did before, but that will make a better product for everyone. And there are resources out there to help with that as well. And I think something we kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to emphasize again, is that actually across the board, all of the sort of different accessibility accommodations, there's a lot of crossover. So once you start kind of checking off the boxes for one area, you're kind of checking boxes off in other areas as well.
And Matt, as you get your audio, pop back in again with us. Do we have your audio back yet?
I'm back.
Yes. What's your one thing?
Okay. The one thing is that remember that disability and special needs is not some people have disabilities, some people don't have disabilities. Yes. We all have some kind of disability. Some of us wear glasses. Some of us need to hear a little bit louder. Some of us, they get disorganized. Some of us forget things. The important thing to remember is that accessibility is something that works for everybody because in some way or other, everybody needs it. But don't think necessarily about the individual with an extreme disability. If you just think about incorporating these practices into your design, it'll work for those with extreme disabilities, but it'll also work for those who don't self-identify as having a disability. Is there anybody listening to this that really has never used captions because they can't quite follow the British accent or the Australian accent or something like that?
Yeah.
Don't keep too strong a label on it. That's my one point.
Such an excellent point. And you know, something you said that Allisyn touched on as well, this idea of it can be overwhelming to me when I think about user testing. Like, how do I find all of the people with this specific kind of disability? And it's when you look at it that it's not all of the people are like this, and then there's someone like this. When you realize that everybody is in a range of these different things, it helps so much to think about getting started and approaching it.
Exactly.
For me, one of the things that surprised me is there's a difference between the knowledge that everybody in your studio has and the cohesive knowledge that prompts action of the studio. For us, just to start with a meeting where we all got together and said, what do we know about accessibility so far, was such a great way to start, because individually people had these resources, or we could do this, or we should do this, or I saw this thing. And once we put that together as a group, it was really a nice way for us to kind of get started on that. Allisyn, did you have something you wanted to add?
Nope, you got it.
Okay, so let's go to the other extreme. You all have been working on accessibility for a while. Obviously, some great advice, great takeaways. What's the next step for you? What is the thing you would like to do that your studio still hasn't done yet?
Me first?
Sure.
I would say we have a long ways to go, but making all of BrainPOP accessible for Matthew and all the other users who will benefit from it. It's a big, overwhelming task, and we're getting there, you know, with baby steps. But I would say, to connect back to your tip, getting to know our users and little by little raising more and more awareness from everybody on our team. Or an animator or a developer, thinking about what you were just saying, Matt, in terms of like, what are my own unique needs and how can this benefit me? I like to watch TV shows with closed captioning, not because I physically need to, but it benefits me and it helps me understand. So raising that awareness firsthand with all members of your team, I think is what we're committed to.
Nice. Matt, this is the central work of your studio, so it's strange to ask you what's next, but what's next?
I think what's next for us is looking at social learning platforms, things like Flipgrid. Just as I said a minute ago, that thinking about putting individuals with disabilities into too tight an area is something we don't want to do. We also don't want to think about that in terms of gaming environments. And as we're moving into this inevitable stage now of blended learning between remote and in-seat and so on, social learning platforms like Flipgrid are going to have, they're going to be at the center of everything. Maybe that one, maybe other ones, but then how does gaming fit within these social learning platforms? And how do what gamings do, how is that going to be transformed in this new era of blended learning? So we're really excited to be getting into this. And within that, thinking about the accessibility issues embedded within rethinking gaming for social learning platforms.
What a great point. Yes. Peter.
So I come through this at the lens, I'm the executive producer of our studio, which is a client services company for the most part. We do create some of our own kind of original property stuff as well. But we've been working with experts like Matt and his team and others to push forward highly accessible games and sites and interactives in various cases. But what I would like to do is create some better on-ramping for potential partners and clients that we work with right at the start of the process to onboard them onto the different, sort of tiers of accessibility, and what's that going to mean in terms of the design process, some of the budget implications there, and timeline implications as well, just so that we're doing our best to educate the folks that we're working with.
All right, so I'm going to call you in a month and ask if I can get a copy of that.
All right, it'll be there.
So speaking of which, Amy Muse has put in the chat for us a PDF of our slides today. So if you would like a set of those, scroll through and look at what Amy posted for you. You can get the checklist and also the resources on there. And we are going to be in the Impact room for question and answer. So please come join us in Impact after this if there's some resources you want to share. Certainly if you have some questions for the group. But I think there's also some issues with this that it's not simple. There's some parts of accessibility that are simple, go, do it. And there's some that are like, oh, this is a little more complex. And these are the parts that are challenging. And I think we might be able to dive into those a bit more.
For the group. But I think there's also some issues with this that it's
there we go.
There's some parts of accessibility that are simple, go, do it. And there's some that are like, oh.
There we go. All right. So with that, thank you so much for this awesome panel. Thank you not only for the work that you all are doing, but for sharing it. A rising tide lifts all boats. So thank you, and especially accessibility. And I just want to give a shout out to the tech team that is making this happen. You guys are phenomenal. We had a little tech lib in the middle of it. And you guys just sailed on through. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.